You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong, happy to be back with you for another week. If you're in Utah, it's a little windy today. It's nice and sunny, but windy. I wanted to go out golfing today, and I could do it, but my game is not quite good enough to counteract the wind that would pushing me on. I mean, maybe it would help me on some holes, right? If the wind's to my back and I shoot well, but that's for another day. So. Looking forward to less windy days, but it's nice to be able to have the sun and be good. This week's supposed to be a little chilly, so chilly compared to what we were moving toward. But this isn't a weather podcast, so we're going to move forward with what we're doing. So just a little preview of what we're doing today. Kyle Whittingham's contract, there was a little update that took place in December. We'll update that, talk a little bit about the beach volleyball program that was cut last week. And then we'll go through the bulk of the episode, which will be the offensive position breakdown. If you remember last week, we did the defensive position breakdown, talked about all the different players there, who's going to step up, who are the role players, that kind of stuff. And so we'll do that on the offensive side. And the offense has a lot more change, and we'll get into that. So before we do that, let me tell you about our partners, though, Canyon View Credit Union. Every possibility begins with a spark, and possibility can grow into something even better than expected. With a clear view of what matters most, your possibilities are endless. From its first flicker at the University of Utah, U First Credit Union has grown to meet its potential and ignites your possibilities. They've grown into Canyon View Credit Union. Same roots, new path. Welcome to Canyon View Credit Union. Check out the full details at canyonviewcu.com. All right, let's jump into it. Let's start with the Kyle Whittingham contract. And admittedly, I feel like I have a little egg on my face on this one. I request the new contracts every single year, even if I feel like there's been nothing that was going to change. I still request contracts every single year, and did my due diligence and got Kyle Whittingham's contract, got all the coaches at Utah's contract, just to kind of see what takes place. It's good for background for me. It's also good to write some stories based on like Jason Beck and kind of what he was getting when he came here as a new offensive coordinator, that kind of stuff. And the way that the contract was sent to me with Kyle Whittingham looked like it didn't change. And so I just kind of glossed over it. I didn't think anything changed, didn't hear anything about anything changes. And so I just kind of moved on and honestly didn't really dig into it. And that's on me. But thanks to Jason Batacchio at the Salt Lake Tribune this last week, he dug in a little bit more and found that there was a third amendment, that was signed in December 2024. So Kyle Whittingham had signed his latest contract in 2022. It was like January 1st, 2022 or something like that. This was the one that, really kind of specified his retirement. It specified a lot of different things beyond just kind of college football and him as a head coach. So that was kind of the basis. And then in September of 2024, so right before last season, he signed his second amendment, which this happens quite a bit. This one was mostly kind of procedural in the sense that it was to change a lot of the, Pac-12 language, just trading it over to the Big 12. Most of these contracts now, they don't actually specify the conference that a team is in. As you can imagine, there's been a lot of changes, and it's just easier to say conference. And so there was a lot of just like procedural stuff that way to change that kind of stuff. It updated that language and then gave him some different incentive bonuses and kind of the updates on stuff like that. So nothing too big. But then in the third amendment that was signed in December 24, there were some things that definitely changed. And most of it had to do with his role after, he's a head coach at the University of Utah. If you remember right, last year there was a lot of conversations about how, it was probably his last year. Everything was trending that way. Quite honestly, the way that it was trending and kind of everything that we were seeing really kind of showed itself that Kyle was hanging it up after the year. Obviously, the season didn't go as planned, and I have to imagine, and he won't say it officially, but I have to imagine that kind of weighed on him and not wanting to end the season, his career on a 5-7 record. There wanted to be more potentially come back and try to do it again. And maybe not even if you don't win the Big 12, you at least are competitive and, have more to kind of show for yourself. So after the season, Utah blew everything up on the offensive side of the ball. We'll get into that one a little bit more, but they blew all that up, stayed hunkered down in the athletic departments, the football facility, and really worked to get a new offensive coordinator, worked to get transfer players, worked to fill out an entire staff and an entire roster on the offensive side of the ball, and really worked. But as part of that, Kyle changed his contract related to his special assistant role. So this is the role that once he declares his retirement, he essentially transitions to a special assistant to the athletic director, where he works like 10 hours a week, or he can work, he can work more than that, but 10 hours a week is the minimum that he has to do. And it was previously set at 5 years. So for 5 years after his retirement, he would be in this role. The new contract essentially gives him a 2-year service after his retirement date. So same thing, he's still a consultant to the athletic director, will still work with the athletic department, minimum of 10 hours per week, that kind of stuff. But they removed his quote-unquote retirement payment category. This was more just kind of the payout for his base salary, outfitter, multimedia rights, that kind of stuff. So they've scrapped that and essentially switched it with just a standard salary where he will get paid $3.45 million every year. So for those 2 years, it was previously only $995,000. But if you also take away that retirement payment, it still comes out to about the same, a little bit more, but just kind of simplify some stuff. So 2 years instead of 5, 3.45 million instead of the almost million plus the retirement payments. And then if he's terminated before the end of the length of his contract, he doesn't retire but is terminated by the university without cause, he gets $4 million per year left on his contract. So that's a massive update to what he gets. And then the biggest thing, which lends itself to kind of looking at this year as his last year, in his contract they added retirement dates. So if he's not in the Big 12 championship game this year, he has to inform the university by December 5th, of this year, if he's going to retire. If he is in the Big 12 championship game, he has to inform them by December 12th of this year. So if he fails to do so, he goes over those dates. His contract basically reverts back to that Second Amendment. So all the things that I just previously talked about goes back to the other amendment. That would mean he'd have to last for 5 years, that kind of stuff. The reality is he'll let them know. And if he decides to stay, I would have to assume that there's a Fourth Amendment made to this. But we're starting to see that they're putting actual dates in there, which leads me to believe that this is his last year, just simply because they've put an actual date in there. It's obviously open-ended in the sense that he just has to let them know. This isn't he has to retire. It just is he has to know or let them know. And so then they can, rework a contract, that kind of stuff. But you're starting to see the end of the Kyle Whittingham era, whether that's this year or still a few years down the road. You're getting to the end. I know there's a lot of excitement to move on to Morgan Scally and kind of see what he can do. Obviously, there's a lot more, I wouldn't call it youth, but obviously he's younger. He's closer to the age of these athletes. He's a little bit more of an upbeat personality. Not that Kyle's not upbeat, but he's much more introverted, likes to kind of do his things and does it that way, whereas Morgan is much more in the weeds, gets in there, would still be involved in that top level aspect, but it's just a different type of coach. And they do have different skill sets. They do have different approaches to the game. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens. Is this pressure from, trying to get Scally in the role? Obviously, he was named the head coach in waiting. Is this kind of the pressure put on Kyle to be able to say, hey, you've got to make that decision so things can move on, that kind of stuff. Really kind of interesting to see how that goes. So nothing too crazy. I don't want to spend too much time on a contract, but there is some definite changes there that lead us to believe that things are wrapping up sooner than later. So that's that. Next thing, last week the University of Utah Cup beach volleyball. Some people may be surprised that Utah even had a beach volleyball program. I understand that, right? Like, there's a lot of different programs. Utah has tennis, they have swimming, they have track and field for the women's side. There's a lot of sports that honestly just go by the wayside in terms of public perception. That's not to say that these athletes aren't talented or deserving of a scholarship or different things that way. But the University of Utah decided to cut the program after their most successful season. So there's a lot of nuances to this, and if we wanted to spend more time on that, and I don't think most people want to spend a lot of time on that. I'm just going to simply say I wrote a really long article on Friday. You're more than welcome to take a look at that. There's a lot of nuances in there. It gets the perspective of the University of Utah, gets the perspective of some former athletes, as well as a former athlete, Melissa Powell, who is a professional volleyball player who is offering to kind of help save the program. So there's a lot of different things there. It's tricky. Universities anymore are going to be working to probably try to manage their budgets a little bit better, and some of that may mean cutting programs, right? Maybe this isn't the first one at the University of Utah. You're always going to hear rumblings about different things that way, especially in this new era where athletic departments are going to be paying players. But colleges around the country are adding and dropping different programs at will. So I don't want to say this is out of the usual, but there are some nuances to it that make it a little different. And there hasn't been any conversation in terms from the University of Utah saying this is a cut as a result of trying to pay athletic players or athletes. It's more because the university felt like it just didn't fit its profile anymore, and it wasn't a good fit based on where they are now in the Big 12 and all that kind of stuff. So, like I said, a lot of nuances to it. You can go read that story. Happy to talk about it more online if anybody wants to chat about that, but we're going to leave that one there and then transition to football, which is going to be the bulk of this podcast with the offensive side of the ball. So, like we did with the defense, we're going to kind of set the stage on Utah's offensive profile, right? And this one is much more easy to define than the defense. Not that the defense is tough, because they're always consistently, ranked pretty highly. There were some nuances there, like the run defense, different, getting pressures, that kind of stuff that Utah absolutely needed to work on. And Morgan Scally has made that kind of the emphasis and focus of his offseason coming into the year. But for the offense, there was so much that it's really just kind of everything, right? And so at the very beginning of the offseason, so we'll say in December, right after Utah finished out the season against UCF and everything was done, then there was a big concerted effort for Utah to really focus in on changing this offense, right? And I've talked about this many times, so this isn't a surprise, but we're going to go through this much more granular, even though we're not going to go too granular because I don't want to bore you. But obviously there was a need to be able to have more, and it was kind of a 2-year trend, and obviously that 2-year trend was more based off of injuries than it was based on personnel, so to speak. But it's still an area where Utah needed to improve. And you go from being at the tops, whether it be 21-22, where Cam Rising was leading the charge and, got Utah to Pac-12 championships, won both, gets them to the Rose Bowl. This is kind of the pinnacle of Utah's offense for the last few years, and everything was humming, right? And there was expectations that last year could be that way, get back to that with Cam Rising coming back. You saw a lot of that going into the season. There was a ton of touchdowns against SUU, which was expected. You get, these games where you're playing Baylor, and the way that game started out, it looked like it was going to be 50-0 by halftime. This was Utah humming along, and everything was rolling. Cam Rising was back to form, and there were still some nuances to kind of. I've said nuances a lot. I'm going to stop saying that. There was a lot of different things related to his game that he was still trying to get back into true game shape, despite being out for a full year. But you were starting to see him kind of piece things together, starting to connect with guys. He had that connection again with Brant Keithy. Everybody kind of felt that same connection that they had in 21, 22, and things were really moving along. And then suddenly, he gets pushed out of bounds into the hydration cooler, the Gatorade cooler. Utah fans aren't going to look at Gatorade very fondly for the rest of their life. So really interesting to see how that will move forward. Time heals all wounds, but it knocked Cam Rising out. And as we talked about last week, it forced Cam Rising to essentially medically retire from the game of football. The injury was pretty severe and forced Cam Rising to the sidelines. And, initially when it first happened, obviously everybody feared the worst. After seeing him getting injured, multiple times, it really derailed seasons, and suddenly you became on QB watch again after feeling like going into the season that things were going to be good. But there was kind of an undertone to his injury that it was, it obviously was more severe than people expected. It's not just like you jammed your finger, but it was one of those injuries that, within 6 weeks, maybe even less, 4 to 6 weeks, depending on how a guy heals, he could be back in full form, right? And everything could be fine. Utah could be okay. Maybe you struggle in the first part of the Big 12 schedule, but at least you're going to get your quarterback to the meat of it, and maybe kind of make that last push for everything. But as the weeks went on, and there was, more drama related to that, we don't need to get into that fully, but as that drama went on where, is Cam playing, is he not? There's a lot of people that didn't know if he was going to, people calling out Kyle Whittingham, people calling out Cam Rising. Boosters upset with the situation because they've paid Cam Rising again to not play. There was a lot of stuff that went down, and it really kind of altered the shape of this team. You had a team that was so high on this season. They were going to come in their first year and win the Big 12 championship. They were picked to win the Big 12. You had a quarterback that you felt uber confidence in. You had an offensive line that was good. You had returners, at every position that were going to be solid. You had new wide receivers coming in that jived with Cam Rising, that they had a connection with, and that everything was going to be okay. And then when he was gone, there was just kind of this funk that hovered over the program. And it's one of those things where, you can't really pinpoint it in terms of, okay, this is what the problem is. But showing up to practice, you could absolutely feel it, right? These players were in a funk. It was like, oh, crap, we're doing this all over again. We just experienced the 2023 season, and now we have to do this same thing in the 24 season. But there was still kind of a little bit of hope in the sense that, okay, maybe it's not that serious, but it quickly deteriorated and things got bad. And this offense, even though Isaac Wilson was kind of, people were excited about that, this young up-and-coming freshman, 4-star local kid, obviously has a ton of opportunity, ton of upside. He's going to get thrown to the wolves a little bit, but goes into Oklahoma State, does enough, wins at Utah State, does enough. You start to see some progress, and then suddenly it all just kind of derails, right? And he starts losing his confidence, and some of the blame gets put on him. And so then you start thinking more as a quarterback, right? And then he starts worrying about things more, and things really kind of start to derail. And so there was just this overall attitude and appearance around the team that nothing was going to work and it was never going to work again, right? And this is just me kind of extrapolating my sense of feeling from watching that. But you saw that in the game as well. Guys weren't as crisp. Guys weren't trying as hard. Obviously, Isaac lost a ton of confidence. He had a ton of pressure put on him. To the point where Brandon Rose, the guy that they said that they didn't really have a ton of confidence in, didn't have a lot of, I don't want to say didn't have a lot of upside, but they didn't feel like he was the best person for that, gets in there, does remarkably well against BYU, gets injured, and just kind of wasn't able to do what he needed to, and Utah obviously loses. Find out that he gets a season-ending injury. But there was like so many factions within the fan base of why wasn't Brandon Rose starting from the beginning? Why is that, there was just so many pointing of the fingers, and the athletes hear this, right? Like they see this, they understand it. They're frustrated as well. And it really caused a rift among everybody. Andy Ludwig announces his retirement, trying to give people that, a new voice. But by then, there was really not going to be much of a change, right? You had Mike Bajakian, who came in there and was doing his best, but even he said, as kind of like a signal to those out there, like, this is the offense, right? We're not going to change. There's not going to be any wholesale changes. It is what it is. It's not like Bajakian was going to go out there and run an entirely new, different offense. It was going to be the offense that they had. Maybe it was going to be simplistic or more simple based on, kind of how Andy Ludwig called things, but they still had to use the Ludwig playbook, right? And you still had the personnel that you had. You had to throw Isaac back in there after Brandon Rose got hurt. And, by then his confidence was shot and everything was really up in the air. So a lot of trauma, a lot of problems. For all that to be said, Utah finishes the season ranked 102nd in scoring offense. They averaged only 23.6 points per game. I think, the beginning of the season and how many points Utah scored definitely added to that average. Because near the end, Utah couldn't do anything. The fact that their defense was holding teams to 20.6, if I remember right, I could go look that up, but 20.6, the fact that you could have just scored 3 touchdowns and won most of these games shows where Utah was at offensively. They couldn't get anything going, and it was a real struggle, right? And so 102nd in the nation in scoring offense, not really a surprise. When you can't move the ball, you're not going to score the ball. So not really a surprise there. But it wasn't that far off from 2023. And so as much as the frustrations came from last year in terms of Utah not being able to move the ball, 2023 wasn't any better, right? You didn't have Cam the entire season. You had Bryson Barnes. You had you moved to different quarterbacks there, and Utah finished 96th. And so it wasn't much better. They're pretty similar spots. And so for 2 years, this offense has been dog crap, right? Like it's been something where Utah fans have been really frustrated with it. And so it's tough because the year before, Utah's last year where they went to the Rose Bowl and went to compete against Penn State, beat USC in the Pac-12 championship and probably one of the more improbable championships, they were ranked 11th in the country in scoring offense. They were averaging 38.6 points per game. And so suddenly you're dropping 15 points a game, and, it absolutely felt that way. Utah couldn't move the ball, and it was a struggle. So don't need to belabor that point. We understand it. Just kind of looking at a few more things. Rushing offense and passing offense both finished 98th. Just weren't generating a lot. Passing offense wasn't as bad as maybe it looked. It did look bad. But I think the more disappointing thing here last year was the run offense, right? You weren't getting anything out of that. Mekhi Bernard, there's games where he went hero mode and really kept Utah in the game. But outside of that, Utah really had nothing. All of these rooms were fractured. There wasn't much going on. And you had a couple guys that were out there playing their heart out to try to kind of save themselves and get themselves to, whether it be the NFL or a good look for professional leagues or something that way. Maybe it's a transfer portal. It just didn't work. And so to me, as much as the passing offense, was disappointing, they averaged almost 200 points a game. It was 199.4. That, you can get by with that as long as you have a strong ground game. And Utah's always had a strong ground game, and that was the most disappointing. And so especially because the year before it was ranked 34th, right? You were able to do well there. The year before that, once again, Utah was 11th. This was a team that was humming along in the run game, and things were going well. And so it's a real struggle to be able to see that. In terms of total offense, Utah finished 115th in the country. 2 years before that, they were 17th in the country. Just a massive drop-off. We get that. Third down conversions, 124th in the country. They only got 32.75% of their third down conversions. But that was more indicative of everything else. They weren't able to move the ball. In 2022, they were 8th. They got 50% of their third down conversions, just slightly over 50.6%. And then red zone conversions. This is a funny number because Utah actually ranked 45th in red zone conversions. They got 87.2% of their red zone trips they scored, but the crazy difference there was touchdowns to field goal ratio, right? Utah scored less than 50% on touchdowns, so that was 48.7 for 123rd in the country and 38.5% in field goals for 4th. So when Utah got there, yeah, they could generally do well in the red zone in terms of getting some points, but that was more field goals. And even then, field goals weren't a guarantee. It was just, this was weighted absolutely towards field goals and not touchdowns. So Crazy difference. 2022, Utah ranked 68th. They were in the red zone a lot more. Obviously, there were still troubles, right? Like there were still conversations had that year about how Utah needed to do better in the red zone, but they finished at 83.6. But the difference was Utah converted 72.6% of their trips with touchdowns, which was the 11th in the country. So truly a massive drop. Just kind of sets the stage for this team. Not that you all needed that. This offense was trash. It wasn't great. It wasn't anything that anybody was proud of. There's very few things that you could pick off that were kind of the highlights. Most of those came from probably Spencer Fano and Caleb Lomu as your two bookends to the offensive line. But for the most part, there just really wasn't anything to celebrate. And as I said, as a result of that, Utah blew up the entire offense. Guys transferred out. They pushed some guys out. They really just went through a wholesale change of everything, right? And outside of Isaac Wilson going into the portal and then coming back, Utah completely remade its quarterback room. It completely remade the running back room. Every single running back transferred from there. Wide receivers, you brought in a ton of new talent, try to get there. The only consistency there really was the offensive line. Yeah, tight end as well, a little bit, mostly. But offensive line was the only consistent factor, really, of this offense. And so there was a ton of change that needed to be done. I argued that going 5-7 was much better for Utah than trying to go 6-6 and getting a bowl game, because this forced them to really kind of hunker down and focus on what they needed to. They got better through the transfer portal because they didn't go to a bowl game, and that's not always something you want to say, but they definitely did. And so with that said, let's transition now to the actual breakdowns of each position group. We know where things went. We know how it happened. Everything was kind of a mess, and now you're looking to this 2025 season with some optimism, right? And after spring, there's definitely some optimism on this offensive side of the ball. The only problem here is, and maybe it's not the only problem, but we'll say the biggest problem here is it's essentially new, right? And yes, you have an offensive coordinator that is much more flexible with what these players can do. It's not as rigid and as laborious as kind of Ludwig's system was. You saw when Cam Rising ran it and he understood it, it was a thing of perfection, right? You could do so much with it and things worked really well. But if you didn't have a quarterback that understood it to the same level that Ludwig did, or at least close to, it was really challenging. And so you do have a new offensive coordinator that is much more free and open to kind of concepts that are kind of what players are used to running in high school. They're pretty simplistic in terms of there's not a lot of checks, different things that way, and so it's much easier for these guys to learn. Now, with that said, that doesn't make this an easy offense, or that suddenly Utah's going to be this great potent offense. But there's components of it that make it so that this team can kind of hit the ground running a little bit more. So, with that said, like the biggest issue here is just a bunch of new pieces trying to work together. Even though they've come together really well in spring, and there's been a lot of kind of focus and move to kind of come together, it still takes time. Once you get into the game, don't expect everything to just be perfect. We'll talk about the offensive line here shortly. I guarantee you when you get into that UCLA game on the first game of the week, there's going to be frustrations. There's going to be some struggles and breakdowns, and everybody's going to look at and undoubtedly criticize this offensive line and say, oh, this was the best offensive line Utah's had, that kind of stuff, and criticize it. It takes time, right? It just takes time to gel, and as much as you can rep it in practice and in the offseason, different things, it just takes a few weeks, right? Every year it feels like Jim Harding's job is on the line after week 3, right? Fans are frustrated. Everybody can't stand it. He has to answer it. And then by the end of the season, everybody's happy with it and they're celebrating Jim Harding and everything. So it's just the ebbs and flows of offenses. You can't simulate these games, especially since you don't want to do that in practice to get hurt. But it is what it is. So let's jump off with quarterback. And like I did last time with the defenses, I'm going to grade these. Some of it's based on potential. Some of it's based on what they've got, that kind of stuff. So with that being said, I'm going to grade the quarterback as an A-, and it's still probably a generous there. Probably B+ is more appropriate. But the reason I'm doing that is solely on Devin Dampier. There's more that goes into that, obviously, but Dampier has been a great asset for Utah in the transfer portal. And that is a great opportunity for Utah because he understands Beck's offense. He comes in here doing very well at a program that just generally hasn't had the same consistency that Utah has, doesn't have the same types of talent or access to the talent that Utah has. And so there's reasons to believe that Dampier is going to be much improved, has obviously a strong offensive line that is going to protect him and give him the time that he needs. And based on what we've seen in spring and everything there's a lot to like about what Devin Dampier can do. He's the true dual threat quarterback. He's the guy that can make, is the engine to make things go, is really solid in what he does. And as long as he can be healthy and perform at a power 4 level, that A- grade is going to be, pretty easy to justify, right? If he struggles, if he doesn't live up to the expectations, isn't the guy that Utah thought he could be, yeah, that grade is completely off, and I'd look like an idiot, and Utah's now down in the dumps again, and you're forced to figure out who your quarterback is. But I think there's a lot of optimism here in kind of who he is and what he can do. Last year, he threw for 2768, 12 touchdowns. He did have 12 interceptions there and only completed passes at 57.9%. We've talked about that. He's improved his accuracy. This is in practice. Keep that in mind. He has improved his accuracy in practice. But on the same vein, he also rushed for 1,100 yards, almost 1,200 yards, and 19 touchdowns. This is a guy that just gets it, right? And he's going to be a threat. He's going to be somebody that's tough to stop, really puts a lot of pressure on opposing defenses to try to figure out what he's going to do. The way Utah has set this up, he can obviously sit back in the pocket and toss the ball around and do what he needs to do that way. He can obviously have designed runs for him. There's some option plays that they can use. There's a lot of trickeration that Utah's really come up with that they feel confident in that can be a regular part of this offense. So as much as Dampier is kind of going to be the engine that makes everything go, as quarterbacks do, Utah feels confident they've done more to be able to kind of offload all of the pressure on Dampier, right? This isn't the same thing as with Cam Rising last year, where when he got hurt, Utah had nowhere to go. They felt like they had somewhere to go with Isaac Wilson, but they feel much more nimble and feel like they can do what they need to be able to help. So with Dampier, obviously this offense can be pretty remarkable if he lives up to those expectations. This could be an offense that absolutely could challenge kind of that level of where they were in the 21-22 seasons in terms of points scored, moving the ball really well, or it could just be a complete disaster, right? And so I'm projecting here, and that's where my grade comes from, but he's obviously your starter. He's the guy that's taken a huge leadership role. He's absolutely been a guy that has rallied the entire team. It's very similar in terms of kind of how Cam Rising came in and everybody talked about him. Everybody had a smile on their face about Rising when he first got there and was kind of becoming the starter. He absolutely is the leader, the alpha in the room, the guy that's there, not in the true alpha where he's, trying to be the end all. He's just more of the guy that everybody focuses on, the true leader that they respect. So a lot of good things there. We don't need to wax poetic on Dampier before he's even taken a rep here at Utah. But there's obviously a lot to like there. Behind him, the two rotation players that are going to get the most looks, and however it shakes out as QB2, QB3 will be interesting. That's Isaac Wilson and Bird Ficklin. Wilson obviously is a sophomore, has a lot of experience just playing last year, but is admittedly, and he says it himself, working to kind of rebuild the frustrations and the struggles that he had last year, right? After being decimated by just all the beatdowns and all the focus, this is going to take some time. And so ideally, Wilson would redshirt this year and be able to have a lot of, just being able to witness, what needs to be done, right? He still has a lot of upside, right? Like, I don't think fans should lose any hope on Isaac Wilson. But with that said, he's being pushed, right? Bird Ficklin is a guy that will push him. Ficklin is more, I would say, in the skill set of Dampier in terms of being a dual threat quarterback. Not that Wilson can't be, but I think Ficklin is much more of that same vein where he, can be the dual threat. He's got the best arm of the bunch. These two quarterbacks seemingly have a lot of potential and can be good backups. But with that said, outside of Isaac, you're still kind of relying, and even with Isaac, you're relying on a lot of youth to kind of get you by. With Isaac, you at least have a guy that has been in the system. He's at least seen the collegiate speed, whereas Bird, he needs that full year to kind of understand it. But you at least have a guy there. And if he can get over kind of some of the whether it's PTSD or whatever it may be, the frustrations, the lack of confidence that maybe has come, I think Utah is in still a good spot. And I think the offense that Beck runs would be more suited to either one of these quarterbacks, that they can do okay. So I think Utah will be okay there. Depth-wise, they do have Nate Johnson listed as a quarterback. He's in there, but he's more of the athlete role. We've talked about this, about how he's more of the Swiss Army knife. He can get in there. You will see him throw some passes this year. You will see him lined up in the backfield. You will see him lined up at wide. There's going to be a lot of things done with Nate Johnson, but in a pinch, you can throw him in there and get him what he needs to. The only struggle with Nate Johnson is he's not consistently getting QB reps in the same vein that, Devin Dampier, Isaac Wilson, and Bird Ficklin are, right? This is a guy that is more used as the utility player, and so he's not specializing in one area. He's doing everything, and so if there was some need that you need him to be the quarterback, you're going to take some obvious lumps because he's not getting in there. Now, with that said, I think that's a deep reserve. I still think they would probably feel comfortable to turn to Isaac Wilson, barring Bird Ficklin just taking tremendous strides this fall. Even then, I think Utah might be hesitant to try to turn it over to a true freshman again, but we'll see. I'm really fascinated to see how Utah designates this. Ficklin 100% was coming on strong near the end of spring, and in my estimation was starting to go and kind of overtake Wilson, but we'll see. So that's kind of where that stands. And then Brendan Zurbrugg, you got to see him a little bit at the end of the spring game where he was able to do some stuff. But he's more of your, true depth. He's going to be there. He's also young in the system. He's a sophomore as well. He can learn and grow through it. But right now, that's kind of their focus. And then you have walk-on Drew Cowart. So you've got some depth. You've got some players that can do it. But similarly to most programs in the country, your starter is your guy, right? Like if he gets hurt, you're going to start looking for other areas. But I think Utah has absorbed a little bit more of what took place last year, and they can kind of deal with that more in a better approach than what was kind of presented to Utah in the system that Andy Ludwig had. So quarterback play will obviously be huge for this team. If the quarterback does well, I think this team really has a real shot to compete in the Big 12. I think there's a lot to like, and things can be pretty efficient and effective if this goes well. So next, we'll jump into the running backs. Running backs, I'm putting it a B+, just simply because there's a lot of new faces. Obviously, a lot of guys that have gotten a lot of reps and done a lot of good things. But based on last year and just kind of the last few years, Utah's in true need of somebody to step up and be the guy. You could arguably put them in that A- category as well, with Wayshawn Parker leading the charge. But until we see him produce at Utah, that's kind of my hesitations. I'm giving Dampier a little bit more projections based on at quarterback, and I should at running back with Parker with the offensive line that Utah has. But I think the last few years, the run game hasn't been as effective as Utah needs. And so I'm kind of more looking on the half glass empty type scenario on running back, whereas I'm looking half glass full on the quarterback. That's my best explanation for that. So with Wayshawn Parker, though, Parker obviously is a phenomenal athlete. Freshman last year at Washington State, finished with 735 yards, 4 touchdowns, averaged 5.36 yards. He was in an offense kind of similar to what Utah has this year, where the quarterback, John Mateer, was a dual threat guy. He ran the ball a ton, and so Wayshawn was kind of the secondary guy to run the ball. Obviously, as the running back, he would be the lead, but he's a freshman. There was a lot there. I think Parker and Dampier this year can be a great 1-2 punch. Parker has a lot of opportunities available to him. He's got a great offensive line that is phenomenal in run blocking, and so there's true potential there for him to be able to do well. He's a decently good pass blocker, and I have to imagine he's only getting better. The one thing that kind of held him back early in spring is he had kind of a little procedure that forced Utah to kind of work him in slowly. He did get in there, but they were much more reserved with him, and he didn't get a lot of reps comparatively to kind of all these other guys. But near the end of spring, he was getting much more into form. There shouldn't be any worry that this will linger. It's just you didn't get to see a ton of him in spring in terms of what he can do. But this guy, he's got great balance. He can hit the hole really hard and really make guys pay, push them back. He doesn't take, he absorbs those hits a lot and is able to kind of get the yards after carry. He is the prototypical running back that I think Utah has been looking for, where he can kind of be the leader of that room. Kyle has obviously said, it's not his yet. I think a lot of that was more just based on just needing to make sure that he can sit in Utah's offense and run it well. But I have to imagine that Parker's going to be the guy, right? Like, I don't see other guys on this roster that are going to overtake him. But I think he's a guy that should give Utah fans a lot of excitement. He can absolutely be a guy that is going to complement Devin Dampier a ton. And with those two just alone, not even counting Nate Johnson in his specialty roles, not counting like a Hunter Andrews, which we'll get to, those types of things, these two alone can be a great 1-2 punch and do a lot of damage. And if you can run them in the option, or you can run them just standard sets, run it up the A gap, B gap, outside zone, inside zone, whatever it may be, I think Utah has enough with just those two alone that they can be much more effective than what Utah was this last year. Beyond him, rotation players, this is where it gets a little more interesting. At running back, obviously, you're not just going to have one guy that is always running the ball. Parker will get the bulk of the carries, though I'm curious to see kind of the limit Kyle puts on some of these players. I think he's approaching more of the 30 carries a game, maybe not early, but I think Utah would feel confident in him being able to get there. Whereas Mekhi Bernard, obviously not the same skill set or style. Utah didn't want him any more than 25 carries, which presented a challenge, especially when you didn't have any other guys in the room that were doing much. So I think there is a change here, but there are some guys in the backfield that can help him, right? Parker will still be the bell cow back, if that's what you want to call him, but there's some proven guys or guys that have potential that can offset and help and add, as a counterpart to what Parker does. First off, that's Naqari Rogers. Veteran guy, a lot of experience. He's a bigger bodied back that has a lot of potential as well. I see him as kind of your short yardage guy. Put him in there on third downs, and he's going to bulldoze a bunch of players. He's going to do really well. At New Mexico, he graded out as an 82 in Pro Football Focus grades on offense, an 82.8 in the run, and then he's their best pass blocker at 81.4. This is a guy that is done really well, and I'm curious to see how that translates at this level. If he can be that same type of guy, if you could put Parker and Rogers in the backfield as a two-back set, you've got some great opportunities there with a great offensive line. Now you have two good pass blockers who can kind of utilize it. There's a lot that you can do here. Both are talented in what they can do in terms of the run game. I would see Rogers as kind of the leader of the rotation guys, where he can kind of get in, but I also see him as kind of some short yardage situations. So curious there. Bryce Duke, transfer from Old Dominion. Honestly, we're not going to know a ton about him. He had some opportunities there, but still needs to do more. There needs to be more to see from him to really give me confidence that he can be right there in that mix in the rotation immediately. But I do put him as a rotation player because he has experience. Beyond that, you do have Devin Green, who was a freshman last year, was a teammate with Parker. These two are a great tandem, a little bit more of an off-speed back where he can do some differences. But I think you're going to utilize him in a way that gets him on the field. He was effective in what he did in spring. There was a lot of exciting plays that he was able to run. And so I think, he can hit the hole, he can get in there. He's got a decent balance and being able to attack that. But he's going to get in that mix there. And then there's Daniel Bray, who I'm listing him as a rotation player, but he's kind of in his own category because there's going to be different play calls for him. He's a type of guy that he's young, he's a freshman, but he's making plays that really just impact it, right? Maybe it's the wheel route that we saw last year, the very beginning of the way, and I'm blanking on the running back's name all of a sudden, that we thought we were going to get a ton for Utah last year. Bray is kind of in that same skill set, right? Where you're going to get specialized packages for him, maybe similar to what Nate Johnson is running, that is going to kind of highlight his strengths. So he's not going to be in the rotation in terms of guys that are getting into the mix a ton for, running up the A or B gaps or that kind of stuff. But you're going to see him, he might, but you're going to see him in specialized packages that allow him to kind of utilize his strengths. Kyle Whittingham talked about that. They want to be able to have him on the field. They don't see a scenario where he's not, but obviously you have to produce on the field, and we'll see how that goes. So I think, there's excitement to be about that. Beyond that, you have freshman Racine Gilroy, who is coming, this fall. He's a younger player, and so he's going to be true depth, right? Barring him just having a phenomenal fall and really kind of pushing forward, he's a guy that you probably won't hear about this year. He's a guy that'll just be in the mix, trying to learn, trying to grow, get into the system, learn the D1 experience. But as a younger player, and I mean younger, he was only 17. I don't think he's still 17. Maybe I could be wrong, but he's young. And then you have 3 other walk-on players that are in there, but you've got a deep room. It's just going to be interesting to see how it all kind of shakes out. Parker's your guy. You got Rogers, who can obviously be a great complement to that. And then beyond that, whether it be Duke, Green, or Bray, Utah has a lot of options there, and I'm really fascinated to see how that goes. Now, wide receiver. Wide receiver is the biggest if factor on this team. I think there's a lot of confidence in, obviously, quarterback play. There's a lot of confidence in the run game. But wide receiver, it's so unknown. There's guys there that I think can be great. And I think Utah feels confident in who they can be, but we've got to see it on the field, right? Utah has a lot of confidence in these players. Dadrian Zipperer comes back. Obviously, was coming on strong. I don't think he's quite yet to the level where he can be kind of the guy. But there's things to like about him. Creed Whitmore was making a ton of plays, especially in the short yardage game. Put him in a screen pass, and he's gone. Ryan Davis, he's a guy that had 747 yards and 3 touchdowns at New Mexico, was the team's second leading receiver. Obviously understands the system that Beck wants to run, and there's going to be nuances to how Utah runs it, but he's going to understand it. He has a connection with Dampier. He's a guy that can kind of be in there and be kind of quote-unquote the leader in terms of understanding that, but it's got to produce on the field. So you got that. And then Utah picked up 2 starter-type players in the portal after spring in Tobias Merriweather. Talked about him recently, 6'5", 200 pounds, has the potential to be your, wide receiver 1. The problem is he hasn't fully shown that yet, right? There's still a lot of projecting to do with him, and if he can be the guy that really embraces that and Utah can utilize him as that, then Utah's in a much better position. You add to that Larry Simmons, who comes from Southern Miss, a more experienced player who's had success there. Can he translate to the Power 4 level and do the same things? If those 2 guys added to the guys that I just said, that's a pretty decent core of projected starters that are going to get into the rotation. You're going to have a lot of opportunities available to you. I still think Utah's run game will relax a lot of the defensive sets that Utah saw last year. There's not going to be a ton of stacked boxes, and so there's going to be potential there, right? Whether that is in the passing game or the run game, I think there's going to be opportunities there, but I think based on kind of what Utah's done to add to this wide receiver room, there is a lot of optimism that it can get there, right? This is a huge projection, though, right? If Tobias Merriweather and Larry Simmons can produce, this becomes a much better situation. You do have some good pieces in Zipperer, Whitmore, and Davis that give you hope that Utah can move the ball around, but you've got to be able to have more of a deep threat guy, guys that can spread the field and allow Utah to do more than just screen passes or, quick out routes or, whatever it may be that are just these more dump-off play type situations that don't really get the chunk yardage that Utah needs. Beyond that, you do have in your rotation Luca Caldarella, and you can make a case that he could be in that projected started unit. I think we've seen a lot of him over the years where, he's done a lot of good things. But then he becomes absent. And part of that, I don't know if that's Utah just pushing him to the side or if that's on him, but he's done enough to be able to be in that mix. So he's kind of on that fringe where I think he can be a guy that can get in there and mix it up and be good, but I think you need other guys to step up to be effective. That's no slight on Caldarella, but I think you need other guys to step up to be effective. Beyond that, you have Rayshon Glover. He's kind of been mixed in there every once in a while the last few years. Justin Stevenson, a transfer from Wyoming, has a lot of potential as well, but once again, a projection, a guy that you're looking at that, he didn't factor a ton in on spring, but there's a lot to like, and if he can really kind of connect with Dampier and the other quarterbacks this offseason, maybe he can hit the ground running a little bit more in fall, and we start to see him coming in there. And then Mana Carvalho, you saw what he could do in that spring game. I mean, he's electric. He's got a lot of speed. He's just a freshman, so we're really curious to see how he factors into that. Maybe he gets into some of those starter role projections. I still see him as a rotation player just based on where he's at. But you have a guy that has true potential. And if you can get him the ball, obviously you have to play defense well against him or he's gonna torch you. And that can mean a lot of great things for Utah. Beyond that, your depth players, Bryson Baker, he's a freshman that's coming in this fall. And then potentially J.J. Buchanan, he's also a freshman. He's a guy that can play offense or defense, and so right now I'm listing him as at a wide receiver just because Utah needs some depth. But there is real potential that he moves over to the defensive side as well. So we'll see what happens there. But wide receiver, like I said, the biggest question mark. I have it as C+, more on the optimistic side that Utah can do it. I think it's probably a better grade than that. But I think just based on kind of the unknown, it's hard to do anything better than that just because we don't know, right? I think Utah will be effective in the passing game, but to what extent and to, who separates themselves, that's the real question. That there's no real answers there, right? A lot of optimism was placed on Zach Williams before he transferred to USC, but even then, he was a projection as well. He had 10 reps to his name. There wasn't a lot of tape to look at. Obviously, he was a guy that was looking to be, emerging as wide receiver one, but I don't think he fully was that guy either. And so there's still a lot of questions to go at this position. So we'll see. This could absolutely be one of those positions that takes off, and Utah does very well with Dampier and the wide receiver group. But let me just say, I don't think it can get worse than a C. I think we've seen bad. I don't want to call it bad, but I think we've seen poor play at wide receivers over the years at Utah, and I still don't know that is to a level where it's completely terrible. Now, unless these wide receivers are constantly dropping passes and they become toxic to the room, to the team, I think C is kind of the floor, right? Like you've got to be able to move up from that, and I think Utah can do that. Even if you can get into that B+ range, I think Utah's okay. Especially if your run game is effective, if Dampier is effective, I think Utah will be okay. So I don't think this is so far off, but at the same time, I think it's still based on projections. Quickly through tight ends, I'm giving that a B, mostly because there's not. Let me just get into it. So projected starters would be Dallin Bentley. He's been in the program for quite a while, has a lot of talent. Really came on strong in spring and kind of showcased his veteran leadership and what he can do. He's a guy that, it was funny, when I watched the tapes last year, he was always the guy open in the flats. And, Utah could never find him. And he could have been a huge difference maker. The problem was there was so much emphasis to try to get more chunk plays that Bentley kind of got forgot. And so I think he's a guy that if you watch a lot of the tape, he's getting open. He's physical. He can play his hand in the dirt and mix it up on the offensive line. But he's also a guy that is a great pass catcher and can do well. He just has kind of been overshadowed by a lot of other players the last few years. And so, it's easy to not know who this guy is. But I think he's got, he's in for a breakout season. And I think he can do a lot of good. Obviously, Jason Beck hasn't run a lot of tight end sets at New Mexico, but as was pointed out, Utah is not New Mexico, and this system can be a lot more effective. And so there will be more tight end play than what you saw at New Mexico, but what level remains to be seen. Beyond that, you do have Hunter Andrews, who will 100% be in that starter role as well. How these two factor in, I don't know if they're going to run, just 11 personnel, 12 personnel, whatever it may be, remains to be seen. But I think Hunter, whether he's lined up in a true tight end position or is more of an H-back type, scenario, I think he is going to be a big X factor in this offense. Similarly to all those other players that I've mentioned, whether that be Nate Johnson or Mana Carvalho or you've got Daniel Bray, some of these other guys, he's 100% this guy. He's got a big body frame that makes him tough to tackle. He's got great hands. He's incredibly fast. I mean, this is a guy that if he can really make the strides that we saw in spring and translate that to fall, I think there's a lot to be excited about, and you're going to start to see a lot of projections about who this guy can be. And, early on, before Landon King transferred from Utah, said that Hunter Andrews is 100% Brant Keithy. That's who he is. And if you can get another Brant Keithy, barring the injuries, Utah's in a very good spot. And that offense, that ups the pass catching game, those wide receivers a little bit better, because I think that'll help them more. Beyond that, your rotation guys is going to be Otto Tia. He did transfer from Utah State, but he's moving from wide receiver to tight end. He'll be in that mix. And then you have Drew Clemens as a freshman coming in. Beyond that, there's not a lot of depth. Not that I think you need a lot of depth, and so I don't think there's a concern. I know Utah has been interested in trying to get a tight end from the portal, but I think this is kind of the bulk of who your players are going to be. And I think you'll be okay. Dallin Bentley and Hunter Andrews are going to be your guy. Otto Tia will mix it in as well and get in the mix there. But I think you're going to see, some good tight end play, despite it not being the 13 personnel or whatever it is where you're just stacking the line with a bunch of guys, right? I think they're going to be utilized differently. And lastly, let's close out on offensive line. Offensive line is easy to project in terms of kind of the potential, the opportunity, and that's an A. There's no position group on this team that I think Utah feels more confident in than its offensive line. It's real easy to say that, and it's also one of those things that people will look at sometimes and be like, really? But there is a strong offensive line that's a veteran unit, a team that understands what it needs to do. They're phenomenal players in terms of kind of who they are, especially Caleb Lomu and Spencer Fano, who are both getting first-round looks in next year's NFL draft. If you can have two NFL-caliber players, especially in those two tackle positions, especially first-round players, that means a ton for Utah. It means a ton for their potential. You kind of see how that goes with these teams, Oregon or some of these other teams that have this great line play. If they can be effective, that helps a team so much. And in spring, there was a lot of time for Dampier to be able to work, right? It'll obviously change in fall in terms of kind of the speed, and guys are kind of crash in more, but you do have talented line that is going to do well. And that starts with Caleb Lomu as your left tackle. You have Tanoa Togiai as your left guard, a veteran player who's been in there, who has a lot of potential, gets in there and has been really good at really solidifying what Utah can do there. Jaron Kump at your center, really the veteran player. He's been at Utah for 19 years, it feels like, but he's done very well for Utah and can be great at kind of helping the play calls, understanding what protections need to be made, different things that way. And so Kump becomes kind of the next, I would argue he becomes the next most valuable player on this team outside of Dampier, because he has to be able to see what these teams are doing. And if he can do that effectively and have a good connection with Dampier, things are going to go much better. Right guard, Michael Mokafisi. Right tackle, Spencer Fano. Like I said, Lomo and Fano getting a ton of publicity. Fano right now comes back to Utah as the top returning offensive lineman in PFF offensive grades and run blocking grades. This is a guy that has a lot of potential. He had a run blocking grade of a 93.6, which is phenomenal. An offensive grade of 92.7 as the team's leader last year. This is a guy that is getting a ton of praise for what he does, and I think it's only going to grow this year. You're going to have a lot of scouts at games for Utah, and it's mostly because of Fano and Lomu. Now, as much as Fano is getting a lot of praise, Lomu is starting to get a lot more as well. He's getting in there. Obviously hasn't had as much tape as Fano just because he didn't play his freshman season as much. But he's in there right in that mix, and he's going to be there's a lot of projections that he could be even better than Fano, which is pretty remarkable. I don't necessarily disagree, but I also could see Fano taking a step up as well, which is crazy because he's already grading out very well. But you have those two anchors on the on the outsides that are really going to help Utah. Beyond that, you have some great rotation players as well. Ike Garcia, for example, has really come on strong. Freshman last year, could absolutely be in the mix where he could be kind of in that starting unit. Maybe he gets mixed in there every once in a while. But he's another guy that they feel really confident about and excited about to see what happens. You also have Keith Olson, Alex Harrison, Zeraway Williams, Kalolo Ta'aga, transfer from USC. Those are probably more your rotation players. And then depth, it's hard to fully kind of categorize this because offensive line, as much as they stay together, there is some times where these guys change out. So depth is kind of a loose term. They could be rotation players as well. Roger Alderman, I know he's mixed it up a little bit in there. Salatoa Moiai, he's mixed it up in there as well. But then you get freshmen Nick Halleck and Soren Scheinefeld. So you've got a deep offensive line that Utah feels very confident in. This is a team that or a unit that could really make the difference for Utah. And if Dampier, like I said, is the guy that Utah believes he can be, and this offensive line is the team that Utah believes it can be, I think they're in for a great opportunity this season. So that's it. I don't want to go too far in the weeds as much as this is still in the weeds, but I think that's where Utah's looking at right now, right? Offensive line play is going to be great. Quarterback play, projected-wise, is going to be great. And then that's all the other stuff that's got to come together. And if Utah/Jason Beck can have the freedom to do what he needs to and effectively run that offense, I think you'll see Utah bounce back. It's once again, it's all projections. It's easy to say that here in March or May. We're in May. But I think there's a lot to like about what this offense can be. But it may take some time to gel. So with that, we'll sign out for another week, and we'll catch you again next week as we kind of start breaking things down a little bit more on other parts of the game. So we'll talk to you later.